Have you ever had the feeling that the world is becoming more dangerous? Wars emerging in different regions, tensions between nations, unexpected crises, and a constant sense that something could happen at any moment. Even people who are far from these conflicts begin to feel an emotional weight as they follow everything that is happening. The question is, how should a Christian look at a world that seems increasingly unstable? In this video, you will understand what Jesus taught about moments of global turbulence and why so many people end up being dominated by fear, while others are able to maintain peace and clarity even in difficult times. You will discover where to place your eyes when the world seems to move toward chaos, and how to develop a kind of spiritual confidence that does not depend on the news, the circumstances, or what is happening around you. If you have ever felt uneasy when seeing the direction the world seems to be taking, if you sometimes notice anxiety rising as you follow everything that is happening, or if you simply want to understand how to keep your faith firm in the middle of an increasingly uncertain world, then stay with me until the end, because what Jesus taught about this can completely change the way you see these times. Before we continue, it is important to mention something. This content was developed with the assistance of artificial intelligence tools to help with research, organization of ideas, and the construction of this material. The goal is to bring a clear reflection based on biblical teachings so that we can look at the events of the world with greater discernment, faith, and spiritual understanding. Now, to better understand how a Christian should look at a world that seems increasingly unstable, we need to begin with a very honest question. Is the world really becoming more dangerous, or does it only seem that way? When we look at recent news, it is hard not to notice an increasing sense of global instability. Conflicts between nations, rising political tensions, territorial disputes, and international crises appear with a frequency that makes many people feel like the world is entering a more turbulent season. Even people who live far from these regions are emotionally affected. Information arrives instantly through social media, television, and the internet. Within minutes, a crisis in a distant country can become the topic of the day worldwide, crossing borders without any barrier. This constant flow of news creates a permanent sense of alert. Many people begin to follow each new development with concern, imagining what the consequences might be for the future of humanity, for the economy, and even for their own lives. Over time, this continuous exposure creates something deeper than simple concern. It builds an emotional perception that the world is always on the edge of something bigger, as if a new crisis could emerge at any moment. At this point, a collective feeling becomes difficult to ignore. Something feels different in the global landscape. There is a growing perception that the balance between nations is more fragile than before, and that small tensions can quickly turn into larger conflicts. But it is important to notice that this sense of instability is not unique to our time. Throughout history, different generations have also lived through periods marked by wars, crises, and major global changes. Empires have risen and fallen. Nations have entered into conflict. Entire populations have faced moments of great uncertainty. Instability has always been part of the human experience in different eras. Still, there is something unique about how we experience these moments today. Never before have people had access to so much real-time information about global tensions and crises. This makes events feel closer, more intense, and more frequent than they actually are. The human mind was not designed to process such a high volume of negative information every single day. When we are constantly exposed to news about conflict, threats, and uncertainty, it is natural for the sense of danger to increase within us, even if nothing is happening directly around us. This explains why many people begin to live with a constant sense of uneasiness, as if something is about to happen, even when they are in safe environments. But this is where something very important comes in for those who want to look at this situation with spiritual discernment. Jesus spoke about times like these. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 24, verse 6, he said, "You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed." These words were spoken in a context where the disciples were asking about the future and about the events that would mark different periods of history. They also wanted to understand how to recognize those times. What is interesting is that Jesus did not present this information to create panic. On the contrary, he mentioned these things precisely so that his followers would not be overcome by fear when they happened. In other words, the presence of conflicts and crises in the world should not completely surprise those who understand his teachings. There is an important distinction here. One thing is recognizing that the world goes through difficult moments. Something completely different is allowing those moments to control your emotional state. This does not mean that wars and tensions are good or desirable. On the contrary, they bring suffering, loss, and instability to millions of people around the world. But the teaching of Jesus reveals something essential. Periods of turbulence are part of human history, and they are not a sign that everything is out of God's control. And understanding this changes the way we respond emotionally. When someone believes that the world should always be stable and predictable, every new crisis feels like proof that everything is falling apart. But when we understand that moments like these have already been mentioned in Scripture, something begins to shift in our perspective. Instead of reacting with panic, we begin to seek understanding. Instead of responding purely emotionally, we begin to observe with greater discernment. And this leads us to a deeper question. If the world really goes through periods of instability, why are some people completely overwhelmed by fear, while others are able to maintain a certain inner peace, even when exposed to the same information? To answer that, we need to understand something fundamental about how the human mind reacts when it becomes fixed on chaos. And that is exactly what we are going to explore now. You may have already noticed something interesting within yourself. On some days, just following the news or scrolling through your phone for a few minutes is enough to make your mind feel heavier, more restless, or even more anxious. This happens because the human mind responds very strongly to information that suggests danger or instability. When we are repeatedly exposed to scenarios of conflict, crisis, and threat, the brain begins to interpret the world as a place that is constantly at risk. Even when we are physically safe, the mind can begin to live in a constant state of alert. Small news updates start to feel like signs of something bigger. Discussions about global politics or tensions between nations begin to occupy more space in our thoughts. Gradually, something subtle begins to happen inside the mind. The focus starts to concentrate almost entirely on what is wrong, what could go wrong, or what might happen in the future. This process is quiet, but very powerful. When the mind fixes its attention only on chaos, the heart begins to react as if it is constantly facing a threat. And this is exactly the kind of reaction Jesus described when he spoke about difficult times. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 21, verse 26, we find a very revealing description of how many people would respond during times of great global instability. The text says, "People will faint from terror, apprehensive of what is coming on the world." Notice something important here. Jesus was not only describing external events, he was also describing the emotional impact those events would have within people. The problem would not only be what is happening in the world, the problem would also be what is happening inside the human mind. When the mind remains focused only on crises, fear begins to take up more and more space in how we interpret reality. This explains why two people can look at the same news and react in completely different ways. One may feel a growing sense of anxiety, worry, and insecurity. The other may see the same information, but without allowing it to completely dominate their emotional state. The difference is often not in the amount of information received. It is in the focus of the mind. When the mind feeds continuously on negative scenarios, it begins to organize thoughts around fear. Small signs start to look like major threats. Uncertain situations are interpreted as inevitable dangers, and the future is imagined through constant scenarios of concern. This is how collective fear spreads. One piece of news creates concern. That concern is repeated in conversations, comments, and discussions. Gradually, the sense of insecurity multiplies among people. Suddenly, many begin to live emotionally dominated by something that has not even happened yet. Jesus knew that this kind of reaction would be common in times of turbulence. But when he spoke about it, he was not encouraging his followers to live trapped in fear. In fact, by revealing that this would happen, he was preparing his disciples not to be carried away by the same emotional wave that would dominate so many others. There is a big difference between being aware of what is happening in the world and allowing fear to control your heart. Being informed is important, but living emotionally controlled by the news is something completely different. When the mind remains focused only on chaos, anxiety grows. When the focus is redirected, something different begins to happen within us. And this raises a very important question. If focusing only on chaos increases fear, then where are people looking for security in the middle of all this? That is exactly what we are going to explore next. When the world seems to enter periods of instability, something very natural begins to happen inside people. The mind immediately starts searching for some kind of security, something that can bring the feeling that there is still control, stability, or protection in the middle of uncertainty. This search for security is deeply human. Whenever the environment around us feels unpredictable, the heart tries to find some firm place where it can rest. Throughout history, people have looked for this security in different places. Some believe stability will mainly come through strong governments, political agreements, or alliances between nations. Others place their trust in the military power of countries. There is an idea that if a nation has enough strength to defend itself or respond to threats, then it will be protected from larger crises. There are also those who place their hope in human progress. Many believe that technological advances, scientific development, or economic growth will eventually solve any major problem that may arise in the future. These forms of security are understandable. After all, political, economic, and technological structures do influence the way the world functions. But there is an important detail that often goes unnoticed. All of these sources of security are, in the end, limited. Governments change. Alliances between nations shift over time. Economies move through cycles of growth and crisis. Even the most advanced technologies can create new challenges that did not exist before. In other words, when someone places their security exclusively in these human structures, their inner peace becomes dependent on something that is constantly changing. And this is exactly where the Bible offers a very interesting perspective. In Psalm 20, verse 7, we find a statement that reveals something profound about the way people look for security. Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. In the historical context of this verse, chariots and horses represented the military power of nations. They were symbols of strength, protection, and the ability to confront enemies. The greater the number of chariots and horses in an army, the greater the sense of security for that nation. But the psalmist was pointing to something different. He was not saying that military strength had no value. The point he was making was deeper. True security should not depend only on visible structures, because any human power, no matter how strong it may appear, is still limited. This shift in perspective completely changes the way a person interprets the world. When someone places their trust only in human systems, their peace becomes extremely fragile. Any political crisis, conflict between nations, or economic instability can deeply shake their sense of security. But when trust is directed toward something greater, something begins to change inside the mind and the heart. This does not mean ignoring the reality of the world. It does not mean closing our eyes to events or pretending that conflicts and crises do not exist. It means understanding that the deepest form of security cannot depend only on what is unstable by nature. Throughout biblical history, we see many people facing moments of great uncertainty. Kings, prophets, and entire nations lived through seasons when the world around them seemed completely unpredictable. Yet many of them were able to maintain an inner confidence that was not based on circumstances. That confidence came from a very clear spiritual conviction that God remains sovereign even when the world seems to move into chaos. And when this perspective begins to form within the mind, something interesting happens. The heart stops looking for security only in external structures and begins to develop a deeper kind of trust. This shift in focus completely transforms the way a person reacts during difficult times. But this leads us to an important question. If true security does not depend only on the circumstances of the world, then what exactly was the posture Jesus taught his followers to have during times like these? The answer appears very clearly in one specific teaching of Jesus, and that is exactly what we are going to explore now. If this reflection is making sense to you and you would like to continue receiving content like this, take a moment now to subscribe to the channel. That way you won't miss the next videos that will also help you develop faith, clarity, and inner peace even in difficult times. When Jesus spoke about times of instability in the world, he did not only describe what would happen, he also taught what the inner posture should be for those who want to live by faith in the middle of this kind of scenario. This detail is very important, because when people think about global crises or tensions between nations, the first reaction is often fear, worry, or a sense of helplessness. But the response Jesus taught is surprisingly different. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 21, verse 28, he said something that reveals a completely different spiritual posture. He said, "When these things begin to take place, stand up and lift up your heads, because your redemption is drawing near." Notice the image Jesus uses here. While many people would have their hearts dominated by fear, looking at world events with worry and anxiety, Jesus describes his followers with a completely different posture. He says, "Lift up your heads." This expression carries a very deep meaning. In biblical language, lifting your head represents confidence, hope, and inner security. It is the posture of someone who is not crushed by fear or dominated by the circumstances around them. In other words, Jesus did not teach his followers to live in panic when facing crises in the world. He taught them a different way of looking at these moments. This does not mean ignoring events or pretending that conflicts and tensions do not exist. Jesus never encouraged his disciples to live disconnected from reality. What he taught was something deeper. He taught that the way we look at the world directly influences how our hearts respond. When someone looks only at crises, the natural tendency is for fear to grow. But when someone learns to look at events through the right spiritual perspective, something different begins to happen inside the mind. Faith begins to interpret reality in a different way. This does not mean the person stops noticing the problems of the world. It means they stop allowing those problems to completely determine their emotional state. This kind of posture requires spiritual maturity, because the natural tendency of the human mind is to react immediately to visible circumstances. When something appears dangerous or uncertain, the human instinct tries to protect itself, predict risks, and imagine possible threats. But Jesus taught his followers to develop a different kind of perspective, a perspective that does not depend only on what the eyes can see. When he said to lift up your heads, he was teaching his disciples to maintain a higher view of reality, a perspective that is not dominated only by external events. This completely changes the way a person walks through difficult moments. Instead of living emotionally crushed by the situation around them, they learn to keep their hearts anchored in something beyond circumstances. This posture does not come from emotional effort. It comes from a deeper spiritual conviction, a conviction that God remains present, sovereign, and active even when the world seems to pass through turbulent seasons. When this understanding begins to form in the mind, something changes in the way we interpret everything around us. The same news that once created anxiety begins to be observed with greater discernment. The same tensions that once felt like inevitable threats begin to be seen within a larger perspective. And the heart begins to experience something many people believe is impossible during difficult times, a peace that does not depend on the stability of the world. But this raises a very practical question. If the posture Jesus taught involves looking at events differently, then how can we actually redirect the mind when it naturally tends to fix itself on chaos? That is exactly the process we are going to explore now. If we observe carefully, we will notice that a large part of our emotional experience is not determined only by what happens around us, but mainly by where our mind remains focused. Two people may live in the same environment, follow the same news, and face the same events happening in the world. Yet the way each of them experiences that reality emotionally can be completely different. This happens because the focus of the mind directly influences the way we interpret everything that is happening. When the mind remains constantly fixed on scenarios of crisis, conflict, and uncertainty, the heart begins to react as if it were always surrounded by threats. Thoughts begin to revolve around possible problems. The imagination projects negative scenarios, and anxiety gradually takes up more and more space within emotional life. Over time, this mental pattern becomes stronger. The mind begins to automatically search for information that confirms this sense of risk. Small pieces of news appear bigger than they really are. Neutral situations start to be interpreted as signs of something concerning. The human mind has a natural tendency to amplify whatever it focuses on. If the focus remains constantly on the news, on crises, and on global tensions, those elements begin to dominate the way a person perceives reality. But the Bible presents a very clear instruction about this mental process. In Colossians chapter 3, verse 2, we find guidance that reveals something extremely important. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. This instruction does not mean ignoring the reality of the world or pretending that problems do not exist. Biblical faith has never encouraged people to live disconnected from reality. What this teaching reveals is something different. It shows that the direction of the mind is a conscious spiritual choice. The human mind can be trained, it can be disciplined, and it can learn to redirect its focus even when the environment around us seems chaotic. This does not happen automatically. Just as the body needs exercise to gain strength, the mind also needs practice to develop stability. And here is something very important in the practical application of this principle. Redirecting the mind does not simply mean thinking positive thoughts in a vague way. It means intentionally choosing where your attention will be placed throughout the day. This may involve reducing excessive consumption of negative news, choosing more carefully the kind of content that enters your mind, and most importantly, creating intentional moments of connection with God. When someone begins to consciously direct their thoughts toward what strengthens faith, something begins to change in the way reality is interpreted. The heart stops reacting only to external circumstances. Instead, it begins to respond from a deeper spiritual perspective. This does not mean the person stops noticing the challenges of the world. They remain aware of what is happening around them. But the difference lies in how these events are processed internally. Instead of allowing every new piece of news to determine the emotional tone of the day, the person learns to keep the mind anchored in something more stable. This process profoundly transforms the way we deal with difficult times. Anxiety loses its strength because the mind is no longer constantly feeding fearful scenarios. Worry begins to decrease because thoughts stop revolving endlessly around the worst that could happen. And gradually, something very valuable begins to appear within the inner life. Clarity. When the mind is no longer dominated by excessive worry, it can perceive reality with greater balance. Emotions become more stable, decisions become clearer, and faith stops being just an abstract idea and becomes a real foundation for emotional stability. In addition, the person begins to develop something that once seemed difficult: control over their own thoughts. Instead of being carried away automatically by every external stimulus, they begin to consciously choose where their attention will rest. This creates a much greater sense of stability, even when the environment around them remains uncertain. That is exactly why redirecting the focus of the mind is not only a spiritual exercise, it is also a path to restoring inner stability. And when this process begins to take root within someone, something powerful starts to happen. They begin to experience a kind of peace that does not depend on what is happening in the world around them, a peace that remains even when circumstances continue to be uncertain. And this is exactly the kind of peace Jesus promised to his followers. That is the promise we are going to reflect on now. And there is a very deep difference between the peace the world offers and the peace Jesus promised. Peace based on circumstances is always unstable. It depends on external factors: good news, stability around us, the absence of conflict, a sense of control. When everything seems fine, a person feels at peace. But when something changes, that peace quickly disappears. This is why so many people live on a kind of emotional roller coaster. One day they feel calm, the next day they are worried. One moment they feel confident, and the next they are anxious again. This happens because the foundation of that peace is circumstances, and circumstances are always changing. But Jesus presented something completely different. In the Gospel of John, chapter 14, verse 27, he said, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled and do not be afraid." This statement reveals that there is a kind of peace that does not function the same way as ordinary peace. Jesus was not talking about a superficial or temporary peace. He was speaking about a peace that remains even when the environment around us is not stable. This completely changes the way we understand what it means to live with calm in difficult times. The peace Jesus offers does not depend on the absence of problems. It does not depend on a perfect world or favorable circumstances. It is born from a deeper kind of trust, a trust that God remains present even when the world seems uncertain. A trust that regardless of what is happening around us, there is something greater sustaining life. When this confidence begins to form within the mind, the heart stops reacting automatically to every external change. The news continues to exist. Conflicts continue to happen. Uncertainty remains part of reality. But the way a person responds to these things begins to change. They no longer live emotionally dependent on what is happening outside. Instead, they begin to live from a place of inner stability. This stability does not mean the absence of emotions. The person may still feel concern and still recognize the seriousness of certain situations, but those emotions no longer dominate their inner state. There is a deeper point of balance. It is as if the person has an anchor. While everything around them may be moving, that anchor keeps the heart steady. And that anchor is trust in God. Throughout the Bible, we see this pattern repeated. People who faced extremely difficult moments yet maintained a peace that made no sense when viewed only through circumstances. That peace did not come from the situation around them. It came from what they were anchored in. And this reveals something very important for us today. The peace Jesus offers is not automatic. It is available, but it must be received and cultivated. It grows as trust in God becomes stronger. It becomes more evident as the mind learns to remain steady even in the face of uncertainty. And this leads us to a very practical point. Living in this peace does not mean waiting for the world to become stable. It means learning to remain stable even when the world is not. That is the difference. While many people wait for circumstances to change before they find peace, Jesus taught that peace can exist independently of circumstances. And when this understanding begins to become real within someone, something changes deeply. Fear loses its strength, anxiety stops dominating, and the heart begins to experience a security that does not depend on the environment around it. But this brings us to the final question. If this peace is available, how can we live practically in a world that continues to go through moments of instability? That is exactly what we will consolidate in the closing. After everything we have reflected on so far, an important conclusion begins to form within us. The world may continue to go through periods of tension, conflict, and instability. Throughout history, different generations have lived through moments when the global situation seemed uncertain, and it is likely that this will continue to happen at different times in human history. But the real question is not only what is happening around us. The deeper question is where we are placing our eyes in the middle of all this. Because when the mind becomes fixed only on the crises, the fears, and the uncertainties of the world, the heart naturally begins to react with anxiety, restlessness, and a growing sense of insecurity. Small news updates start to feel like major threats, and the future begins to be imagined through constant scenarios of concern. But when the focus is redirected, something begins to change within us. Faith begins to reorganize the way we interpret reality. What once felt overwhelming begins to be seen within a larger perspective, and the heart stops reacting only to what is happening in the present moment. This is exactly what we find in Isaiah chapter 26, verse 3, where it says, "You will keep in perfect peace those whose minds are steadfast, because they trust in you." This verse reveals a deeply important spiritual principle. Peace does not come only from the absence of problems. It comes from the direction of the mind. When the mind remains anchored in God, the heart finds stability even when the environment around it remains uncertain. Trust in God creates an inner point of balance that does not depend on the stability of the world. This does not mean a person stops noticing what is happening around them. They remain aware of reality. They continue to follow world events and understand that challenges and difficulties exist, but something inside them remains steady. They are no longer emotionally pulled in every direction by each new headline, every new conflict, or every new global tension. There is an inner stability that does not depend on external circumstances, and this completely changes the way a person moves through difficult times. While many people live dominated by fear of the future, those who learn to anchor their minds in God begin to develop a peace that is not easily shaken. This peace does not come from denying reality. It comes from trust. Trust that God is still present. Trust that He is still sustaining history. Trust that even when the world seems unstable, the life of those who trust Him remains secure in His hands. And when that trust begins to grow, something very important happens. A person stops living merely reacting to what happens in the world and begins living guided by a deeper faith. This brings clarity to the mind. It brings emotional stability to the heart. And it brings hope even in times that seem difficult. Perhaps the most important question to reflect on now is this. Where have you been placing your eyes? Are they fixed only on the crises, the tensions, and the uncertainties of the world? Or are they directed toward what can truly sustain your heart in difficult times? Because in the end, the world may continue to change. Circumstances may continue to shift. But those who learn to anchor their minds in God discover something that many people are still searching for, a peace that the chaos of the world cannot take away. If this message spoke to you, take a moment now to subscribe to the channel. That way you can continue receiving reflections like this, content designed to strengthen your faith, bring clarity to your mind, and help you develop an inner peace that remains steady, even when the world around you feels uncertain. And if you know someone who has also been feeling uneasy about the direction the world seems to be taking, share this video with them. Sometimes a simple reflection can bring exactly the spiritual direction someone needed to hear. Thank you for staying until the end. And remember, even in times of uncertainty, the peace that comes from God remains available to those who choose to anchor their thoughts in Him.